Our next speaker of this morning is Julius Bryant, who is the keeper of word and image at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And he has the responsibility for paintings, prints, drawings, and designs, miniatures, watercolors, photographs, the National Art Library, and the Archive of Art and Design. He's a busy man. Between 1990 and 2005, Julius was Director of Museums and Collections and Chief Curator at English Heritage, based at the Ivor Bequest at Kenwood, where he specialized in the restoration, redisplay, and reinterpretation of historic houses open to the public, such as Kenwood, Chiswick, Marble Hill, Ranger's House, Osborne, Broadsworth Hall, Darwin's Down House, Eltham Place, and Apsley House. He is co-curator, together with Susan Weber, of the exhibition John Lockwood Kipling, that's in this year in 2017, and he served as the V&A's lead curator for two previous exhibitions, also in collaboration with the Bard Graduate Center here in New York. James Athenian Stewart, that took place in 2007, I think many in this room saw that exhibition, and William Kent, that was mounted in 2013. His publications include Kenwood Paintings at the Ivor Bequest, Yale, 2003, Art and Design for All, the Victoria and Albert Museum, published in 2011, and Designing the V&A, the Museum as a Work of Art, that has appeared this year. His publications on British sculpture range from Thomas Banks, 1735 to 1805. That was published by the Soane Museum in 2005, and Sculpture in the Mansion House, 2014, and in addition, Caro Close-Up, published in 2012. This morning, Julius will offer his substantial insights into British garden sculptures with his wonderfully titled lecture, Gentlemen Prefer Bronze, Garden Sculpture and Sculpture Gardens in the 18th Century England. Please welcome Julius Bryant.
Well, good morning. You can all hear me. Thank you, Inga, for that warm introduction, and thank you also Ian Wardropper, Samantha Deutsch, Esme Quadbatch, and especially Malcolm Baker for inviting me to contribute. I have had a few compliments on my choice of title, so I feel almost guilty about the expectations it may have aroused. I feel I ought to begin with a bit of a disclaimer. I'm sorry, guys, Marilyn Monroe will not feature in this paper. But don't all walk out. Nor will I be talking about something that I know from yesterday, especially that this audience finds even more sexy, namely bronzes. But the title isn't just some sort of cheap trick to get people in on a Saturday morning. My serious point is that we need to put the act of aesthetic judgment back at the centre of the social experience of sculpture in the British landscape garden. And in my first slide, which is a drawing by William Kent, I show the Duke of Devonshire and his family at Chatsworth. I'm not quite sure who's who in this picture. The Duke is the tallest, but his son married Lord Burlington's daughter. And I'd like to just think, what are they actually talking about at this point? I think that's the core of my paper, trying to get inside their minds. And I'm making the case, as I say, that aesthetics was a major issue, major talking point. But I thought I'd begin slightly cheekily by quoting Malcolm Baker's email invitation to me to contribute to this conference, which is, if you like, the brief for this paper. He wrote to me, we are planning to have one section on garden sculpture, a rather problematic category of sculpture, and mindful of your work on William Kent at Stowe and Rousham, I was wondering whether we might persuade you to talk about garden sculpture in Britain and the way in which such examples might constitute collections. So I feel I'm slightly the underdog here, and especially after following that magnificent paper on Versailles and Dresden. But you get used to that working on British art, especially British sculpture. So anyway, the challenge, it's a tough act to follow, and my pictures are not going to be anything like as glamorous. But the challenge Malcolm has set me is, I think, to I think, to demonstrate that there were collections of garden sculpture in 18th century Britain. As is well known, sculpture plays a key role in the show gardens of mid-18th century Britain. If I can just advance the slides, I'm showing you a risebrack from two different angles from Stowe, now at Anglesey Abbey. And this is what we tend to think of when we say British garden sculpture of the 18th century. To the Augustan age's poetic gardens, sculpture contributed symbolic and associative content as key ingredients in allegorical circuits. And since the 1970s, historians of gardens have followed the example of Stowe in seeking lost sets of poetical or political keys to unlock coherent explanations for garden sculpture as symbolic ingredients in coherent programs, as features to prompt reflection and topical conversations. Historians have sewn many sculptures back into these narrative paths at Stowe, at Stourhead, at Rousham and elsewhere, as emblems illustrating political and moral standpoints. Historians have deciphered the weathered inscription, and they've cleared away the overgrown visual relationships, as if reconstructing lost texts. So what makes British garden sculpture problematic? Well, this paper proposes that sculptures could also be meaningful as visual experiences in their own right, as of aesthetic value, especially for the benefit of improving public taste. Taking this approach, some of Britain's garden sculptures, I think, deserve fresh viewing as art collections shown outside for the public, in brief, as sculpture gardens. The main difficulty in making a case for garden sculpture as art worthy of collectors is that in Britain it's pretty bad, actually. Its status is relatively low, to put it politely. If an art collection is something formed by a connoisseur intent on representing a range of artists, then we were wrestling yesterday with what we actually mean by a collection, but that's one I'll throw at you as a definition, or of presenting fine reproductions of masterpieces. Well, garden sculptures rarely make the grade. Our appreciation of garden sculpture in 18th century Britain tends to be polarized. So away from works like this, from the bespoke works commissioned for their subject matter, this is Tuesday, TEW, one of a set of 7 ancient Anglo-Saxon deities that were commissioned for Stowe and were used to make a political point about the ancient liberties of the country. I'm sure you know Stowe is this protest garden against the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole. So there are these bespoke works in Portland stone by Michael Risebrack, Peter Schoemakers and others, now rather badly weathered. But there are also the casts, and you may need to look away at some point this morning. There are these casts, often polychrome, that give British garden sculpture a bad name. These rather less studied, down-market, ornamental sculptures, mass-produced in lead. If I can just advance this. Yes, there we go. This is also at Anglesey Abbey. This is Meleager and Atalanta, Diana and Actaeon. It's got a fake John Cheer signature on it. It's probably by Andrew Carpenter, his predecessor at Hyde Park Corner. And of course, it's naked. This raw lead was not the way these things were meant to be seen, and it's only really since the early 19th century that they've been exposed to the elements in this way and have therefore deteriorated. So you would have it either painted white or polychrome naturalistically, or you would have it bronzed with copper dust in varnish. So in general, these derivative copies of celebrated sculptures from antiquity were made to ornament British country house landscapes, in contrast to the French formal gardens we've just seen, where modern sculptures in marble were preferred. Even lower in critical standing, it gets worse, are the reproduction leads of light-hearted pastoral, commedia dell'arte, and other characters like this, and other novelties, that really only ask to be taken as seriously as the porcelain figurines that decorate dessert tables. Typically, these are, as Malcolm has definitively written, these arouse in a volume of several instances of satirical verse and writings at the time, and we now identify them, thanks to Malcolm, with the city businessman, the cit, as the kind of taste for the nouveau riche, the parvenu, painted naturalistically rather than bronzed or left white as if marble. Another example, this is this kind of urban garden. This is Fenton House in Hampstead, where they were displayed. In 1846, J.T. Smith, who had been assistant at Joseph Nollekens, he wrote of John Cheer's, I quote, despicable manufactory, whose leaden productions were never countenanced by men of true taste. For it is well known that when applications were made to the Earl of Burlington for his sanction, he always spoke of them with sovereign contempt. End of quote. And thanks to the English weather, these lead sculptures tend to have cracked. The rain penetrates through the cracks, rusts away their iron armatures, and I think the vast majority were melted down, recycled as sort of drain pipes and guttering, and as lead. So few survive today of this vast lost population, which makes their rehabilitation of the few restored survivors even more of a challenge. So to make a case for collections of garden sculptures as art, for establishing the idea of sculpture gardens in 18th century Britain, I need to find for you some sculptures in gardens that appealed primarily to the eye rather than to the ear, or to the viewer's sense of fun. We need to identify the exceptions to the rule, the garden sculptures of real artistic ambition that were not simply illustrative or decorative like ornamental vases and grand flower pots. What particularly attracts me to make a case for garden sculpture as a serious field of collecting by connoisseurs is my own long-term study of the rise of modern ideal sculpture in Britain. This prestige genre is normally credited to the Royal Academy after its foundation in 1768, but there are many precedents. We can also see how some sculptures contributed to the wider aesthetic appreciation of the gardens of noted connoisseurs, as the taste for the picturesque overtook that for the poetical garden. My personal guide towards a more visual way of viewing garden sculptures has been William Kent, who as a designer moved away from the literary use of sculpture as advocated by his friend Alexander Pope towards a more picturesque deployment of statuary as part of a broader aesthetic adventure. To underpin these claims, I will quote some visitors to gardens, but to be brief, I want to focus on one aesthetic treatise that seems remarkably absent from the publications by the current leaders in the field of British 18th century art history, whether of paintings or sculptures, namely William Hogarth's Analysis of Beauty, published in 1753. It's such a well-known text, but it hasn't been written about. I guess people are teaching it, but there's been nothing in print that really looks at it seriously since, I think, the 1960s, 70s. Hogarth's formalist treatise provided a wide public with a means to learn how to look at sculpture. Within a month of publication, it was translated into German, and Hogarth directly influenced the writings of Lessing, Winkelmann, and hence, in turn, Clement Greenberg, and the formalism of 1960s abstract sculpture. So indeed, Hogarth's Analysis of Beauty could be the missing link between John Cheer and Anthony Caro. So for a quick overview of the state of garden sculpture studies in Britain, we can visit the V&A, which is the national collection of post-classical sculpture. The V&A opened its Sculpture in Britain galleries, which I show you here, in March 2008. The traditional thematic grouping by portrait busts, funerary monuments, models, ideal, and garden sculpture was retained from the previous galleries, but the move of the collection from one vast top-lit Edwardian space into a series of Victorian galleries running along the south side of the garden, to my mind, was a real improvement, for the setting is analogous to the conservatory of a country house. And here, garden sculpture is grouped around a pair of central glass doors that lead into the quadrangle gardens of the museum, and so they benefit from north-facing windows. The flood of natural light is reinforced by spotlights, and these are controversial. These rather confirm the ambiguous status as outside art shown indoors. As this gallery is about sculpture in Britain, not British sculpture, it does include two large groups from Augustus the Strong's Palace at Dresden by Carradini from 1735, as we saw a moment ago. They remind us also the relative lack of royal patronage for marble sculptures out of doors in Britain, and indeed the European marble groups do seem to be rather looking down on their British neighbours. On the British side of the gallery, the main attraction is two relatively recent acquisitions, both by Michael Rysbrack, both made for Stowe around 1729. Tuna, we see here, represents one of the 7 Saxon deities carved for Cobham's Garden, Stowe. Better known as Thor, he is the most powerful of the gods and gives his name to Thursday. We also have Suna, if you see there, which comes from the same commission where it represents Sunday. According to the V&A's online catalogue, I quote, "The Saxon gods are tied in with the political iconography of Stowe and symbolise Lord Cobham's allegiance to the ideals of those Whigs who had broken away from Sir Robert Walpole. As such, they symbolise an ancient British identity." So that's the official line on these sculptures. After leaving Stowe through sale in 1921, they continued spending their natural lives out of doors, and the Portland stone has lost its surface in both cases. Facing the garden doors, set apart from other sculptures in highly polished white marble, they are clearly meant to be read as political garden sculptures from Stowe through their symbolic attributes, and indeed by the setting of Tuna on this tall high plinth as at Stowe. Their art historical literature reinforces this reading. However, in their afterlives as museum objects, they do invite and they do repay an aesthetic response, as I'm sure Rysbrack and his client also intended at Stowe. One admirer from the time was Daniel Defoe, who wrote of the Saxon deities in his Tour Through Britain of 1742. Without dwelling on political symbolism, I quote, "All the statues are extremely good, and this scene agreeably strikes the mind with serenity and composure." Standing alongside is another garden sculpture. This was purchased in 1985, Andrew Carpenter's lead Meleager of about 1725. Still with its hexagonal stone base, it probably comes from a gate pier, and with his spear, horn, and hound, the hero who killed the Caledonian boar would have welcomed visitors to a country house with the prospect of good hunting. Any possible political reading would require knowledge of its original home, but its condition, lacking almost all its original ochre-coloured paint, like the Stowe sculptures, can make it rather like going into a museum of archaeological finds. You see the surfaces there, rather than an aesthetic experience. As a lead sculpture, Meleager is the V&A's sole representative of the material that most populated the gardens of Georgian Britain. Conspicuous by their absence from the national collection are those light-hearted shepherds, shepherdesses, and other figures made of lead and naturalistically painted by Cheer and other sculptors based at Hyde Park Corner. Closest to them in spirit is the fourth British garden sculpture in this display at the V&A. Boy playing bagpipes, carved in Portland stone by Caius Cibber around 1685. Its original owner and location are unknown, but after 1722 it stood at Witton Park, the Middlesex villa of the second Duke of Argyll. So perhaps he felt that the musician struck a suitably Scottish note for a Scottish duke for his guests. Despite being made by the sculptor to both Charles II and then William III, its relatively low aesthetic standing seems defined by the use of stone, by its weathered condition, and by the fate it shared with so many maltreated sculptures, including Meleager, the ultimate humiliation perhaps of being included in an auction of, quote, garden ornaments. Indeed, the case for acquisition made by the curator of sculpture in 1929, Margaret Longhurst, is almost apologetic. She wrote on the acquisition file, "It is not very attractive, but works by this sculptor are very rarely come on the market." And in reply, the deputy keeper of sculpture, Richard Bedford, writes, "We should try to get it for our collection if it goes for a small price. We may be able to repaint it so that it may be put out in the quadrangle." So there is, of course, an exception to all this. One great garden sculpture is to be found in the V&A's higher status space, the British Galleries, and that, of course, is Roubiliac's marble statue of George Frederick Handel of 1738. This allegorical portrait of the composer as Orpheus calming the beasts by playing a lyre may allude to the wild guests around it originally in Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. There it was recognized in its day as a masterpiece of modern sculpture. The ambition for it as a work of status, despite its rather down-market location, perhaps this was to raise the tone of Vauxhall, its status as art is evident from the quality of the marble and from the prominent signature that identifies Roubiliac on the left as both sculpted designer and carver. However, in our readiness to present this as a masterpiece of the Rococo in our period galleries, we risk divorcing the sculpture from its country cousins, such as Cibber's Highland Piper. The problem of lead sculpture is that the price of its commercial success led to overproduction, trivialization, and deterioration in aesthetic quality. The blame for this is usually laid at the door of John Cheer, as we heard J.T. Smith do. The only publication devoted to Cheer is this catalogue on the left for the exhibition from 1974, curated by Timothy Clifford and Terry Friedman, entitled The Man at Hyde Park Corner. Cheer's lead statues only featured as photographs in the exhibition, which was more devoted towards his plaster and ceramic busts and statuettes for libraries. The catalogue's cover illustrates Hogarth's engraving of a statuary's yard, and the identification of this with Cheer has become familiar. I show on the right a watercolour and a map of Hyde Park Corner, because the surprising thing is that they're not there. And when we talk about Hyde Park Corner, we really are talking about the north side of Piccadilly, around Portugal Row, and indeed not just John Cheer, but about between 8 and a dozen sculptors over nearly a century. 3 or 4 generations of sculptors were in this very productive area. It's a whole artistic community, rather like St. Martin's Lane. And the great difficulty of rehabilitating Cheer, if anybody wants to, is that when a sculptor moves in, he would acquire his predecessors, his neighbours' yards stock, so that you have Cheer acquiring carpenter's work, and you have this recycling. So attributions become very confused. But I want to dwell on the Hogarth engraving, because despite the humour, I mean, there is humour in this. There's this dancing master who's telling the Antinous to stand up properly, and there are parodies of Westminster Abbey monuments. But despite those jokes, this is not a sort of scene of such as J.T. Smith describes. It's not a comic spectacle of misshapen modern lead sculptures. Indeed, as one of 2 didactic engravings accompanying Hogarth's treatise, The Analysis of Beauty, the print is all about learning to look at art, quite specifically at outdoor sculpture, for its aesthetic value. Hogarth's treatise is part of his campaign for popular connoisseurship, for the ownership of taste by the public at large, rather than by grand tour educated connoisseurs alone. His book is about formal analysis as a way to discover elegance, especially in the human figure, in 3 dimensions. Hogarth's gauge of beauty is not the mathematical proportions of classical statues measured in elevation, which we see going on bottom right. There's a figure looking at the Venus in the centre mapped out as though that's the secret of understanding beauty, is you need to recognise the harmonic proportions of each element of the body. We usually identify Hogarth with the two-dimensional serpentine line of beauty, as he first included it in his self-portrait in 1745. But the emblem on this book's title page, you see, and it's not simply a flat serpentine line of beauty. It is a spiral serpent in a crystal pyramid. The three-dimensional rhythm Hogarth called the line of grace, a visual theme Hogarth learnt from Michelangelo via Lamazzo. And this is echoed in the centre of the engraving by the Laocoon group set beneath a sculptor's tripod. It helps to explain Hogarth's principle of intricacy. I quote, "that peculiarity in the lines that leads the eye a wanton kind of chase." From Hyde Park Corner, I'd next like to visit some gardens where aesthetic responses to sculpture would have been encouraged. John Cheer made at least one original lead garden sculpture for a connoisseur as a one-off. The river god in the grotto at Stourhead, for which he charged £98 in 1751. By comparison, 5 years earlier, he sold to the same client an Apollo and a Diana from his stock for £51. So £25 was a lot for a single lead statue, and this is £98. So clearly, Cheer's river god was in a different league. And his source was not some old mould that he'd inherited from Carpenter or after the antique, but it was an original work based on an engraving after Salvador Rosa. So it was an original sculpture that could have teased the visual erudition of his patron, the collector Henry Hoare, and his guests. The sculpture has been understood, at least since the 1970s, as part of an allegory of Aeneas's journey in the Aeneid around the lake in the garden on the right, and he gestures, as you saw, up towards the Pantheon, the building on the left, the garden temple, where strollers entered and still find another original sculpture made to impress, Rysbrack's Hercules. So the temple inside on the right and then the Rysbrack on the left. This was begun on the artist's own initiative in 1747 and was completed in 1756 at a cost to Henry Hoare of over £400. So that's twice the price of a portrait statue by Rysbrack, nearly 20 times the price of a lead statue from Hyde Park Corner. As was discussed at the time, this was no copy after the antique Farnese Hercules. The head is the same, but the body is a composite of 7 or 8 living men of noted boxers who the sculptor studied, just as Hogarth would advise in his analysis of beauty, 1753. This is finished 1756. The pose, I show you Rysbrack's original model in the library at Stourhead, flanked by the engraving after Pietro da Cortona, which is his source, and obviously the Farnese Hercules, just to show the contrast. This is an original work. George Virtue saw it in progress in 1752 and judged it a masterpiece of art. Horace Walpole judged it the sculptor's chef-d'oeuvre, his Hercules, an exquisite summary of his skill, knowledge, and judgment, unquote. The connoisseur's responses need not exclude an allegorical reading. We could read it in the center of a group of statues as a choice of Hercules, the subject of a painting by Nicolas Poussin in Hoare's collection, which is on the left of the slide, where perhaps the modern ideal sculpture finds himself, rather like Paris, admiring his female companions. The flanking figures are not mere plaster cast after the antique. One is a lead copy of Lord Leicester's celebrated Diana at Holkham. Another is a restored antique marble of Livia Augustus as Ceres. There's a plaster Meleager supplied by Cheer, a plaster Isis, and a copy of St. Susanna after Ducray Noir. The sixth flanking figure is another original variation on a classical source by Rysbrack, commissioned in 1758 as a companion in marble, for which he was paid £400 in 1761. Horace Walpole similarly responded to it as art, not as part of a garden narrative, judging it, I quote, much inferior to the Hercules. The head is particularly flat and without grace. So there are these other ways of responding that are recorded. Despite their appeal to the visitor's aesthetic judgment, the National Trust's guide to the gardens explains the presence of Hercules this way. I quote, "The significance of Hercules is as an ancient cult figure associated with gardens." I just feel we don't need to keep thinking in terms of narrative programs. An alternative way of looking at sculpture in gardens that was recommended by the poet William Shenstone in 1764 was about seeing it as part of the landscape. He wrote, "A statue in a room challenges examination and is to be examined critically as a statue. A statue in a garden is to be considered one part of a scene or landscape." This picturesque approach is the way William Kent set sculptures in gardens. Horace Walpole, visiting Rousham in 1760, so we move now to Rousham. Horace Walpole noted, "The garden of 25 acres, the best thing I have seen of Kent." But of the sculpture, Walpole only remarks, "Grove of Venus de Medici, the whole suite." Kent's client at Rousham was a terminally wounded soldier, Lieutenant General James Dormer. Kent's only known design for one of his garden sculptures in the middle there is for a sarcophagus-shaped pedestal for a copy by Schoenmakers of the Dying Gaul. This has prompted several speculative readings of Rousham. There is a vast bibliography for Rousham from many, I don't know, about a dozen articles since the 70s and one book. And they all see it as a funereal garden. There are 19 stone sculptures, 13 lead figures, and a further 18 sculptures in garden buildings. And most prominent is Schoenmakers' copy on the far right of Lion Attacking a Horse of 1742, which fits the theme of death in battle. But it does seem a bit of a stretch. I'll give you an example. So this is Kent's drawing of the Venus veil at Rousham. But one of these theorists of the sort of program, I quote his account of this. "Within the sloping glade of Venus Vale, Kent engineered a landscape trompe-l'oeil wherein fountains ejaculated orgasmic columns of water as if from the lawn itself." Perhaps more important than General Dormer's military record and his terminal decline, especially to the way he wanted to be remembered, was his love of collecting sculpture. Dormer was a friend of Lord Burlington, who gave him some of his own bronzes, and indeed, according to Kent, Dormer was quite bronzo mad. I show you a pair of bronzes by Girardon that were at Rousham from at least 1743 until they were sold at Christie's in 1984, and I'm sure we'll hear more about these later today. So he's bronzo mad. His library, Malcolm was mentioning yesterday, is really Kent converted into a studiolo in which to display and study his collection of bronze statuettes. A comprehensive narrative program for his garden seems unlikely, and the visual structure of Rousham's sculpture garden would fall apart if there were no sculptures to serve as picturesque compositions, as landmarks, as attractions to the visitor, and sources of guidance to them. These approaches, I'm going to end with Chiswick, these approaches all come together in another compact villa garden created by Kent and a connoisseur, namely Chiswick for Lord Burlington. Despite J.T. Smith's invocation of Lord Burlington to damn lead sculptures from Hyde Park Corner, there were several at Chiswick. The finest of them, I show you here on the right, is now at Chatsworth, a copy of Jan Bologna's Samson and the Philistine. The original marble fountain figure had stood on a plinth in the garden of the Duke of Buckingham at York House by 1624, and lead copies soon became popular. This one's always called John Cheer, but I think it's probably by Richard Osgood, for the one he sold to Lord Falkenberg for Sutton Court at Chiswick in 1695 is untraced. But Burlington purchased Sutton Court to extend his villa garden, so he could well have harvested his neighbour's sculptures at the same time as he bought his land. Now, paintings by Michael Rysbrack's brother, Peter Andreas Rysbrack, I show you some details on the left, from around 1729 show it to have been something to be admired by these people strolling in the gardens. If we just compare Rijsbraek's, these are Peter Rijsbraek paintings of the garden with the sculpture up here and here in full, and then the upper is Peter Rijsbraek, 1729, the lower is George Lambert, 1742. And what I ask you to consider there is how the garden has been transformed more, how the sculpture becomes more prominent. Burlington himself designed great urns to lay out, so the garden becomes much more about sculpture rather than planting by the 1740s. And indeed, we can see that in John Donowell's engravings, which Burlington commissioned, I believe, which were published in 1753, the year he dies. Chiswick became a well-populated sculpture garden, and indeed it was open to the public by admission ticket, and it provided, I think, a polite Italianate alternative to the rather frivolous Francophile Rococo gardens at Vauxhall. And Burlington also commissioned Jacques Rigaud to produce many drawings of it. This is Donowell. You can see the man admiring the sculpture on the right. And then we have a wonderful series of drawings by Rigaud that show the public dealing with the fences and admiring the sculpture. I'll just whiz through these. And the Jambologne on the far right there again. And the Guelphi probably made the terms, some of which survive, but also appear in these engravings. But the temptation to find political symbolism in Chiswick's gardens is irresistible, especially as, like Lord Cobham at Stowe, Burlington had withdrawn from public life in 1733, partly in protest at the actions of the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. The connection is closest in Kent's initial design for the Exedra, which you see here, which Burlington rejected, and the artist recycled at Stowe as the Temple of British Worthies on the far right, and at Stowe. And then this is the subsequent sketch for what to do with that space. One might, and then Kent had done some more drawings of it, one might read Burlington's Exedra, completed in 1738, as a secret political discourse. There are antique statues of Caesar, Pompey, and Cicero from Hadrian's villa at Tivoli, standing over 12 classical seats that were designed by Burlington, and they're flanked by some slumbering British lions. We could read this, I've tried to read this, as the empty senate of a nation that needs to wake up. Burlington and Kent designed another 27 antique vases that frame vistas in rows and add a solemn funereal air. But in the gardens, a simpler explanation may be that Burlington collected contemporary sculpture. The promotion of his Venus de Medici copy from the front lawn, where we saw it in Lambert's painting, to the top of a column, thanks to William Kent, may help to present her as presiding over a garden of love. We could read it symbolically, but it seems more likely that she's here as a symbol of beauty, as in she stood in the center of Hogarth's engraving. A similar aesthetic statement can be found at the entrance Burlington created after acquiring Sutton Court, which you see here, where he placed an obelisk with a classical relief from the collection of Lord Arundel on its base. If this suggests anything, it is that you are welcome to enter the garden of the great collector of his generation, dubbed by Horace Walpole the Apollo of the Arts. Burlington was criticized by Hogarth for his patronage of Italian culture over British, but at a time when sculpture, not painting, was the leading form of contemporary art, Burlington was busy commissioning what we now regard as British sculpture. He ordered outdoor sculptures from Guelphi, Rijsbraek, Scheemakers, John Cheer, and paid Andrew Carpenter to bronze lead busts at Chiswick. But Burlington may have gone too far, for in 1762, William Gilpin lamented the loss of the picturesque gardens there, finding at Chiswick, I quote, "a great profusion of statues and urn, which give ye lawn before the house, ye appearance of a statuary shop." So to conclude, the story of British garden sculpture and the way people looked at it in the 18th century is not all about reading poetical or political iconography in great estates, or about looking away from embarrassingly bad lead statues from Hyde Park Corner that are misplaced and misunderstood in the gardens of the city businessman. This polarization, I think, isn't sustainable. There is a third path, and a case can be made for popular aesthetic viewing of modern works in the sculpture gardens of collectors. So that's it. There's no Marilyn Monroe, guys, but to avoid total disappointment, I just thought I'd offer a little postscript and revisit the V&A's sculpture galleries. Our visitors can choose to read sculptures as symbols taken from poetical or political gardens, but they can also judge garden sculptures as the sculptors, collectors, and as Hogarth intended, as the art of composing in 3 dimensions. In brief, British garden sculpture can be sexy. Thank you.